Victor Davis Hanson profiles 5 generals who he argues single-handedly turned around wars that their countries were losing. It's a little over an hour.
Thank you very much for coming out on a weeknight in Fresno in the summer. I know it's been very hot here, and I appreciate it. I'd like to talk just for about 30 minutes on the theme of the book, The Savior Generals, and then I'd like to have questions from you for 15 or 20 minutes, if that's okay. You know, there's a whole genre of generals, leadership, in the terms of what succeeds and what fails. So there was a 19th century genre, the great captains, by a man named Dodge. There was the great battles of the world, and we were supposed to learn that across time and space, Saladin or Hannibal or Wellington and Napoleon had particular characteristics. They were audacious, or they were calm under fire, or they were especially schooled in military history. Some magic ingredient that they shared with like kindred souls across the centuries. And then there was the other genre, anatomy of error, anatomy of folly, all of the losers of history. Mark Clark in Italy, Westmoreland in Vietnam, Marshal Ney at Waterloo. And we were supposed to learn what not to do. And these were not only biographies, but they were also models of leadership. They were very popular in the 19th century. But the more I, over the last 30 years, read these little miniature or pocket biographies, the more that I noticed that in a lot of cases, Napoleon won when he had greater numbers or greater organization, or he was not fighting the entire alliance of Europe. Or in World War II, a great savior general was, of course, George Patton, North Africa, who came into command after the Kaiserine passed. But there's no greater fan of George Patton than myself. But had Patton not been in North Africa, we probably would have found somebody like Lucian Truscott or Manton Eddy that could have assumed that role of leadership, because there were other factors, Hitler's stupidity, the genius of George Marshall and Allenbrook on the Allied side, the role of the Russians, that would have made the victory still possible. So I tried to look across history and say, well, what happens when the war was lost? Not only lost tactically, strategic, politically, but the people, whether it was mostly in a consensual society, but sometimes in authoritarian governments, they gave up as well. And then the war was not lost. And who came in at the 11th hour, and why, and what can we learn from them? Well, it turned out there's dozens of people. You know, Curtis LeMay took over the B-29 program when they said it wouldn't work, and the rest is history, what he did at Japan. But again, I was looking for generals where there was no hope, and if you took an individual out of the battle equation, it was clear to me they would have lost. And I tried to look at the personal characteristics or the command style or the level of erudition or experience they had. And so I took Themistocles of Athens, and I'll give you a little 5-second summary of each one, and then I'll go back and talk about what the traits were that were common to all of them. And remember, in 480 in September, there was no Athens. It had been burned to the ground by the Persians, been occupied by Xerxes. It was the largest invasion of Europe until D-Day, 250,000 people. They swept from Anatolia all the way down to northern Greece. There was no Greece left. It was just the Peloponnese and about 17 city-states. Athens was the demarcation line. The great city-state of Sparta wanted everybody to retreat across the Isthmus of Corinth and give up. One man said, no, we cannot. In fact, if you leave us by ourselves, we'll sail away. And they had a large fleet of about 200 ships. The Allies together had about 370. And they were outnumbered, depending on whose figures you believe in antiquity, 3 or 7 to 1. And one man decided to make that stand. And he could make that stand because for the last 10 years, while everybody had been advocating that the marathon model of infantry was a way to protect Athens, one man said, no, we've got to invest in ships and sailors, the poor, radical democracy. And he was not just the savior of Athens at Salamis, but the architect of what would become the Athenian Empire. Everything before Themistocles was a defeat, and everything after Themistocles at Plataea the next year was a victory. He single-handedly, by his genius, saved Athens, saved Greece, in some sense saved Western civilization in its embryonic form. He was a maverick, he was part Thracian, he was iconoclastic, he was a contrarian, he was obnoxious, he lied, He was a atypical politician. He demagogued the people. He slandered his enemies. And he was an absolute genius. What was wrong with Persia? What was wrong with Persia? Everybody said you cannot stop King Xerxes and this armada. And he said, wait a minute. It's getting late in the year. It's now September. We're at home. We know the currents of Salamis Bay. They don't. They're 700 miles from their supplies. We're here. They just burned the city that was supposed to house them. By any empirical, logical, but not emotional calculus, they're in trouble. And that seemed absurd. And yet he was able to sway the Spartans and the Corinthians to stay with him. And they went on that day to defeat Salamis, which is probably the greatest, or I should say the most lethal sea battle in history. 80,000 Persian sailors probably were killed, much more than Lepanto or Midway or Trafalgar. The second person that I looked at, if you fast forward almost 1,000 years, we don't really know much about him anymore. If I say Belisarius, maybe some of you have read Robert Graves' great novel, Count Belisarius, but otherwise we don't know who he was. He was a very obscure guy. The Byzantine Empire, remember, in the 6th century A.D., we're talking about 525 to about 545, was on the ropes. Rome had for a century lost the West. Vandals, Visigoths, Ostrogoths had overrun Italy. They had occupied North Africa. They had cut the empire in two. The Greek segment, the Greek-speaking Roman Empire, had collapsed around Constantinople and areas in Anatolia, and they were swarmed on their frontiers mostly by what we would call the Sassanids or the Persians. And this is right before the rise of Islam, and it looked pretty bleak. An iconoclastic king named Justinian, emperor in the Byzantine context, had a wild idea of 100 years after the fall of much of the Western Empire to retake it. And he entrusted this 20-something young man named Belisarius. He sent him east, and he began to win. He defeated the Persians. He went all the way to Iraq. He fortified the border between Byzantium and Persia. He fortified what we call now the Holy Land, the Middle East. And then, most spectacular of all, he sent an armada with only about 18,000 men, about 800 miles all the way to where what we would call Tunisia and Libya and parts of Morocco, which had been overrun by Vandals for 100 years. Some of you who are fans of St. Augustine remember him being trapped at Hippio Regius, where the Vandals overran North Africa. And that was sort of the sign, the first inroad that marked the end of Roman civilization. Very tragic to read. And yet, in a matter of 90 days, Belisarius took back North Africa, reclaimed it for Christian, Greek-speaking Byzantium, proclaimed that he had united the West, and didn't stop there. He went to Sicily, did the same thing, and then he went into Italy. And just as Themistocles was sort of a renegade, so was Belisarius. In a nation of Greek speakers, he was a Latin-speaking Thracian, which really did him well in the West where people spoke Latin. He was young, and unlike most Byzantine commanders, he was not corrupt. He had two main tenets, because the Byzantines, as you know, were always outnumbered. They relied on discipline and technology and mercenaries, but he said that he had to be a fish that swam in a local pond. So he enforced strict discipline on soldiers. They did not loot or steal from the Berbers or the Sicilians or the Italians. But in the first sign of counterinsurgency strategy, he incorporated local populations to help him, and he used lightning-quick tactics. He avoided pitched battle, and he was able, in a period of 25 years, to reclaim, at least for 2 generations, Byzantine power in the West. When Belisarius started, the Byzantine Empire was about 40% of the former Roman Empire, and when he finished, it was 80%. And some of you say, well, Justinian died, there was a great plague that wiped out 1 million Byzantines. Belisarius ended up in poverty and blind, and a lot of that land was either lost to the Visigoths, the Lombards, or the rise of Islam. Yes, but what it did, it provided a critical cushion around Byzantium, because lo and behold, where most people thought that the Greek speakers in the West would fall around 600 AD, they lasted 900 more years. Didn't fall to that Black Tuesday, 1453. all because of the efforts of, I think, one man, Belisarius. It was the heyday of Byzantium. This is when the great Hagia Sophia church was built by Justinian, and there was the great blues and greens rivalries in the Hippodrome, and he was a man of his times. The third, I thought, well, was there a modern counterpart? And I didn't want to write about people I had before, but in one case I made exception, and that was William Tecumseh Sherman in the Civil War. Now, most of you remember Gettysburg and Vicksburg, July 4th, 5th, and 6th of 1863, and we all say, well, that's where Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. Earlier, we had done the Emancipation Proclamation the year before. The Union juggernaut of manpower, technology, greater resources, industrialization had just worn down the South. Bobby Lee was not going to go ever north again. True, but fast forward a year later, and let me name some other titles that might give you a different impression. Cold Harbor, the Wilderness, Petersburg, Spotsylvania. In that horrible summer in Northern Virginia, Ulysses S. Grant destroyed the Army of the Potomac. It was not an army, it was a revolving door where immigrants came in, were enlisted, and were killed or wounded and replaced by others. And Grant had been the hero in March of 1864, given his spectacular victories in the West at Fort Donelson, Fort Henry, Shiloh, and the hero of Vicksburg. Lincoln thought he was going to plow right into Richmond, and as they left in May, he turned over the Army of the West to William Tecumseh Sherman, and they had a very interesting exchange. And if I could summarize both their letters and the impressions of people at the time, Grant was supposed to take Richmond, which was only 70 miles away, and the other great Confederate city was Atlanta, which was over 200 miles. Northern Virginia was settled. The corridor between Washington and Richmond, as you see today, is only about 75 miles. From Tennessee, northern Tennessee, to Atlanta was wild. And Sherman had to take an army not just to Atlanta to take that city, but had to navigate through swamps and dirt trails. They both faced an army of about 70,000 men, and they were both brilliantly led by Joe Johnston in the west and Robert E. Lee in the east. So what happened? Well, and then within 90 days, Mary Todd Lincoln said that Ulysses S. Grant was a butcher. Horace Greeley said, the question is not whether a Lincoln shall be elected in the fall. We should not nominate him in June. On his left wing, John C. Fremont said he has abandoned the cause of emancipation. He's not promoting the interests of blacks. He's an ignoramus. And on his right, George McClellan, a Southern Democrat, was saying, and I will have a negotiated peace. We've lost 250, 300,000 people for what? We'll have a status of, we'll go back to the status before the war, let the South either join the Union with slavery or be autonomous on its own. And it looked like it was almost impossible. If you were to look at the newspapers of the time, the New York, Chicago newspapers, you couldn't find hardly anyone who supported Lincoln. Horace Greeley, as I said, at one point had become his greatest supporter, and then he turned into his greatest critic, especially after Cold Harbor. When Grant said, I intend to fight it out here all summer, people said, oh my God, he really means it, in the sense that he was destroying the Army of the Potomac. So they both went out in May, and why Grant slowly ground down Lee and ground down his own army and did not get that close to Richmond. I mean, he got close in the sense of 10 or 12 miles, but he could not take the city. Sherman started to outflank Joe Johnston. Everybody in the East was covering the war in Virginia. Nobody knew what was going on in Tennessee and Georgia. The communications were poor. Sherman had problems with the rail lines. There was a genius named Nathan Bedford Forrest who was slashing at his flanks. And Sherman began to develop a philosophy. And he said, we can have one Grant. Basically what he said, we can have one Grant but not two. We can lose the Army of the Potomac, but the public will not stand me losing this army. So he deliberately outflanked Joe Johnston and made a wide circle around Atlanta. And while at first people criticized him because Grant was going directly in Clausewitzian fashion right toward Richmond, pretty soon they began to appreciate what Sherman was doing. And when the South became so exasperated because they were on their home ground, they knew the terrain, and yet they were losing more men trying to fight in head-on fashion against Sherman, who was outflanking and avoiding direct confrontation. They made a fateful error and switched command, and they brought in the reckless, although in some ways audacious, John Bell Hood, and he began to fight head-on against Sherman. And other than Kennesaw Mountain, Sherman won every battle and only lost, I say only, but about 30,000 casualties versus 100,000 in the West. On September 2nd, Sherman walked into Atlanta and wrote a telegram from Atlanta to Abraham Lincoln and said, "Atlanta is ours and fairly won." And it was almost amazing, the national reaction. You could not find one person in the United States who was ever against Abraham Lincoln. People had damn Grant, damn Grant, damn Grant as a butcher. Suddenly Sherman, in very magnanimous fashion, said, no, 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 no. He was doing something very necessary. He was grabbing Bobby Lee by the ankles while I came around the rear. This was complimentary. This was a symphony. And you know what would happen next? As soon as the election, Sherman would take off through Georgia, do the same thing as he had done on the way to Atlanta, go to Savannah, pause for Christmas, send another telegram, "I give you Savannah as a Christmas present, Mr. President," and then go into the Carolinas and come up behind Lee in Virginia. Civil War, in some sense, was not won by Grant destroying Lee's army. He never did. It was because Sherman came in behind him with the Army of the West. Remember, the Army of the West were mostly of the 200-some regiments, Michigan, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. These were not people from New York or Massachusetts. They were growing up on farms. They liked to camp out, and so Sherman's tactics of rapid mobility, camping out, avoiding direct confrontation, they liked it. It emboldened them. They got bigger and better the more that he went into the Deep South. And so in some ways, Sherman, I shouldn't say in some ways, had there not been a Sherman, Lincoln would maybe have been nominated, but he surely wouldn't have won the election. He went on to defeat, he won 56% of the popular vote. George McClellan had a lot of momentum in September. He was writing letters to Sherman and others as if he expected to become the President of the United States, and suddenly Sherman took Atlanta, and for 1 week he didn't say a word. And what was he supposed to do? Say, Sherman shouldn't have taken Atlanta? He was a Union officer. I'm angry that he took Atlanta, so if he praised Sherman, then it showed that Lincoln's strategy was right all along. Lincoln didn't say much, just smiled, and as he would say often of Sherman, he went into one hole, and I don't know where he is now, but he came up in another hole, and all's good. William Tecumseh Sherman saved the Union effort, and I can't think of anybody in the time, a George Thomas even, or a Sheridan, who could have done that, and they were probably the best that the Union Army had. I want to skip just the fourth person in the book and go to the most recent and controversial, and I'll get back to Matthew Ridgway, and that's David Petraeus. When David Petraeus, after the disastrous election for George Bush in 2006, remember the resignation of Donald Rumsfeld, the idea that something had gone wrong in Iraq, and there had to be a new strategy. The Iraq Study Group had basically been ambiguous. We have to do something different. Maybe we should send troops. Maybe we should get out. There was a small group of scholars at the American Enterprise Institute, some luminary names like in the military like H.R. McMaster's, but around, Jack Keane is another, but around all of this group of scholars and soldiers, one name kept popping up, David Petraeus. He has a new counterinsurgency strategy. Would Bush dare to gamble and surge when everybody had, by the way, 28% of the American people supported the Iraq War at this point, low point in the beginning of 2007. And if you think that's normal, 73% had supported it when the statue fell in April of 2003. So that the national mood could be best summed up as, my brilliant 3-week takedown of Saddam is now your terrible 5-year occupation. Whatever you think about the war, I do have some admiration for people on the left who said it's a bad idea, and they took a lot of blame when the statue fell and they looked ridiculous, and they looked very smart as the war got worse. I have a lot of admiration for people who said we got to go in there and change the Middle East, and they stayed with it the whole way. But the people, the majority, said we've got to go in, and now it's somebody else's fault why the soldiers were left hanging. And that was the situation nationally when Petraeus started to the momentum started to build to make Petraeus the new commander. And he was appointed at the end of 2006, and he went into Iraq with about 130 to 140 to 120 casualties, deaths, American deaths a month. December 2008, when he was done, he had finished in September, there was no Americans killed in Iraq. What happened? Well, ostensibly, he had more troops and he changed strategy, build and hold. He tried to win the hearts and minds. Again, the idea, like Belisarius, was that if you want to win the war, you have to consider the population fish that live in a pond, and you have to feed them. And so he encouraged electrical development, social outreach, constitutional. But we'd been doing that. But there had to be something else. And here's where the controversy, I think, is today. Because there's 6 or 7 criteria that we know worked. Number one is we'd been fighting for 4 years. And we had been, for all the criticism of the war, we had been inflicting enormous casualties on the insurgents and the ex-Baathists. At some critical mass, that started to turn the tide. There simply were people getting killed. The 2 times I went to Iraq, I would see people with tattoos, the old Baathist tattoos, and they would come up as we went to Fallujah or Bakuba, and they'd say, my son was killed here. My son was with he didn't say Al-Qaeda, but my son was with the insurgents. He was killed there. And you got the impression that they were getting very tired of this. Another possible reason is that everybody thought we were leaving, sort of like Afghanistan. But when Bush surged, he said, we're not going to leave until we win. Win was sort of the W word. You weren't supposed to say it. Tommy Franks earlier had said that we don't look at this as a victory. So there was an idea that we better deal with the Americans because they're not going to leave. Maybe that helped. Obviously, killing more soldiers was a political dilemma. You remember the body bags in Vietnam. So when Petraeus said he was not interested in body counts and was interested in building bridges, at the same time people like Stanley McChrystal and very skilled officers were taking an enormously lethal toll on the enemy. Sort of like Barack Obama, who says, I really don't like the Bush protocols, the anti-terrorism, why he increased the drone tally by 10, knowing that he would not be criticized in the way Bush was. The same manner, Petraeus realized the more he talked up counterinsurgency, the more lethal his troops could be in the shadows. And finally, of course, there was the Anbar Awakening, where popular Sunni tribal leaders stood up and said, we're sick of Al-Qaeda, they're thugs or criminals, they're not representative of Islam. Whatever it was, more troops or increased tally or the Anbar Awakening, something coalesced and momentum built, and David Petraeus saved, and I say saved, whatever Iraq will be, it will be something, but it wouldn't have been anything had he not conducted the surge in the manner he did. I said I wanted to save because my favorite chapter of all 5, and I think the greatest savior general in the history, at least of American military practice, was Matthew Ridgway. And some of you look at me like, who in the hell is Matthew Ridgway? When he died in 1993, Colin Powell gave a very eloquent, probably his best speech. He said, every American soldier owes this man. And he was a very unlikely, just like all of these people were very unlikely. He was 53 years old. He'd had a heart attack. If you know your World War II history, if you think of the 3 most seminal battles in the United States conducted on the Western Front in Belgium, Normandy, up in the Netherlands, they're the Normandy invasions, the Bridge Too Far Arnhem campaign, and the Battle of the Bulge. Matthew Ridgway was at all 3 of them as an airborne commander. Even though he was in his late 40s at the time, he was a 2-star general, highly decorated. I don't want to get into all the things he did in Sicily, but he was a genuine hero among many heroes at the time. He did not achieve the notoriety or the fame and glory as George Patton or Omar Bradley or Dwight Eisenhower, but he was a reason why the United States won World War II. Then he became proconsul of the Mediterranean and had a heart attack. And he thought his career was over, so they shipped him back as a desk job as a deputy chief of staff to the Army. And he should have ended up in 2 years, and that would be it. He's watching the military out in the post-war, and you might remember from your history what happened. 13 million Americans had been in the military. We ended the war not by invading Japan, but by dropping 2 atomic bombs. The Air Force came out and said, this is the new way of war. It's nuclear. Nuclear, nuclear, nuclear. We need Air Force jets, strategic air command, maybe submarines, but old-fashioned assets like the Army and especially the Marine Corps, what's the use? Because anytime you get in a war, it's going to go nuclear. They're outdated. Truman wanted to cut the Marine Corps. Lewis Johnson wanted to slash conventional forces. And this clerk, I shouldn't say that, but he was acting as if a clerk named Matthew Ridgway was writing brilliant memos saying, no, 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 you don't understand. Conventional war is going to be more likely because nobody's going to go to the war with nuclear weapons because it's going to be Armageddon. So we have to build up our conventional forces, but in a very bright and sophisticated manner because they could always escalate to a new. So he was a big visionary, but people didn't pay attention. If you remember, we were in this dilemma. After World War II, we had the thankless task of reforming whom? The fascist Italians, the fascist Japanese, the fascist Germans, and turning them into good Democrats. Meanwhile, our so-called allies, the Chinese, had gone communist, Russia had gone communist, and they had the enviable task of saying to the world, we always fought the Japanese, Italians, and the Americans. Now they have joined the Americans, and we're here to liberate you. And we lost 20 million in Russia, and they lost 10 million in China. We carried the burden, and now America's betrayed. And this was the fault lines throughout Europe and Asia in the 40s, at a time when we were dismantling our forces. And one of the flashpoints was in June 25th in Korea, when the North Korean army went across the 38th parallel, quickly overran the very few Americans that were there. We kind of forget this, but in 8 weeks, all that America was in Korea was in a small Pusan perimeter. There was a big fight. This is the beginnings of the MacArthur period. There was supposed communists in the State Department. There were supposed people who wanted to go to nuclear war. Curtis LeMay was talking about the survivability of a nuclear war. It was a very dark time in American military and political history. And Douglas MacArthur, the great Douglas MacArthur, remember in World War II, as Pacific commander, he had this wonderful reputation of being caught blind and losing all of his assets, as he did on the Philippines, and then making enormous recoveries. Same thing happened here. He was blindsided. He was in Tokyo, 70 years old, was not on the front, completely surprised, and then he came up with a brilliant idea of landing American troops hastily deployed and put them at Incheon, trap the North Koreans in the south. He did that in a brilliant September landing at Incheon. America suddenly say, we can still win this, let's give MacArthur more troops. And then he made a fateful decision, and after cutting off North Koreans in South Korea, he said, now is the time to finish it for good. He went across the 38th parallel, full speed up to the Chinese border. He announced that Americans would be home for Thanksgiving. He destroyed the North Korean communists for all practical purposes. And a man named Chou Enlai had warned the United States, if you get close to the Yalu River, we will invade. Truman was so scared, he went to Wake Island to talk to MacArthur. People as astute as Omar Bradley, people like Eisenhower, they had warned MacArthur, as you go north, if you look at the Korean peninsula, it gets wider and wider. You're further and further from American bases. You're closer and closer to Chinese depots. It's getting cold. It's now October. No matter, MacArthur brushed it off. People had also warned him that MiG jets, the MiG-15 was superior to the F-80, and they were achieving air superiority. We weren't sure, as we are now, that Russian pilots were mostly manning those MiGs. And then all hell broke loose in late October and early November, where somewhere between 300 and 500,000 People's Republic of China soldiers rushed across the border. The UN, remember, had supported the war and thought that they were going to be peacekeeping forces. 88% of the manpower was supplied by the United States. I'll make a long story short. What ensued from October to the end of December was the longest military retreat in U.S. military history, over 400 miles. We had a word in the 50s called bug out. That was the first time people had used it in a military context, the great bug out, where Americans simply threw down their weapons in some case and ran back to the 38th parallel, pursued by new North Korean troops that had been trained in China, and an aggregate force of 500,000 people in the dead of winter. Chosin Reservoir, you remember all these great names in American military history, but 15,000 Americans were killed in this retreat, over 3 times what was lost in 10 years in Afghanistan. And more importantly, in one day in November, 790 Americans were killed. It was a complete disaster. There was utter panic in Washington. MacArthur looked like a fool after being declared a genius. The Joint Chiefs who had given MacArthur a green light suddenly said, we didn't tell him to do that. It was basically wrong war, wrong place, wrong time. Nobody had believed that Stalin had given the green light to the Chinese. MacArthur, completely surprised, suddenly said, they didn't give me the tools to win the job. I want nuclear weapons. I need 25 bombs. And I want to bomb Manchuria. I want to use the B-29s and expand the war. And the reason that I can is because I've got communists in the State Department. So this was the beginning of who lost China, who lost Korea. In the middle of this, the senior ground commander who was in charge of the 8th Army, there was a Marine commander, but the senior ground commander was a man named Walton Walker. And although he had been a very good Corps commander under Patton in World War II, he was completely out of his league, and he died in a tragic Jeep accident. So now you have the senior commander dead, everybody fleeing across the 38th parallel, the Navy ready to pick them up at the very tip of South Korea and forget the whole thing. And you can imagine the consequences on everything from Taiwan to Berlin with this great communist victory. And nobody really wants to go to Korea. And then people read, well, there was always this Ridgway guy, and he fought pretty well in World War II, and he's a moralist. He's been married 3 times. He married a woman 20 years younger. He's kind of weird, and he thinks you can win a conventional war in the nuclear. Let's send him over there. Guy had never been to Korea, never been to Japan. He flew in the dead of night, didn't even have a chance to tell his wife, and he lands in Japan, and he sees the great MacArthur, and MacArthur's in shell shock and says, 8th Army is yours, Matt. Do what you need to do. And he lands in Korea in dark, and he meets his generals, and they're all ready to flee, and he says, well, what's the plan? And the plan is retreat, 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 retreat. And Ridgway basically says, I will stay here until I can find one person who wants to win, win, win. And where's the attack? And they said, we can't attack. And he says, you can't attack because you're not giving the men food. You're not giving the men mail. You're 50 miles behind the lines. You got to be up in front with the men. And they immediately called him Old Iron Tits. He had a grenade on one breast and a medical kit on the other. And he sometimes flew a Cessna, and he got right at the edge of combat. If you ever seen the famous Time magazine, he was ramrod straight, mid-50s, very handsome, and from the old school. I guess you would call him a classical liberal. He believed immediately in integrating the troops. I guess this is what we call talking points today, but he put little cards out for all the soldiers to realize why somebody from Cincinnati or Fresno was stuck in an ungodly place like Korea, which was called a police action. He said, you're here because the United Nations authorize it. It's legal. You're here because we're stopping communism, which is the successor to fascism. We're here because we gave our word to South Korea that we would give them a chance, however dictatorial, to evolve. And he actually told people why they were fighting. And then he did something else in the fashion of Petraeus and Belisarius. When everybody thought the war was over and lost, he got his commanders together and he said, let me get this straight. We went 450 miles all the way to the Yalu River, and we could barely support our troops. It was cold. And then they're doing the same thing. But unlike us, they do not have air superiority anymore. We have F-86s now. They're just coming in. We're going to have B-29s flying daylight missions. Our soldiers had proper logistical support. They had food. They don't. They're suffering from typhoid. If it was too dangerous for us to be 500 miles from our support, what do the Chinese think they're doing all the way down here in the 38th parallel? And nobody thought that was possible because the Chinese at night shine lights. They blew horns. They had whistles. They had propaganda, megaphone recordings. Everybody said these are the new communist supermen. We've never fought any ideological warriors. These are the Asian hordes. Truman called them Tamerlane returned. Ridgway said, no, no, no. They're humans, people, just people. And they're too far from home, and they're too cold, and they're hungry, and we are going to backpedal, not retreat. We're going to backpedal to fortified lines of barbed wire and artillery. Now, we may lose Seoul, and he did within the first 2 weeks, but that's all we're going to lose. And when they get to the farthest point from their own base of support, we're going to attack like you won't believe. They will never know what hit them. They're not used to American artillery. They're not used to American napalm. And I'm going to give you a series of offensive, and he called them Operation Roundup, Operation Killer, where the Chinese very poorly organized, unexpectedly ran into a fleeing enemy that had stopped cold, had 150 millimeter, everything from 88 to 150 millimeter. UN troops were now in better spirits, and in a series of brilliant counteroffensives, he took frightful casualties. One of the great tragedies of the Korean War, and there was a lot of tragedies, is the sheer number of North Korean and Chinese communist soldiers that were annihilated. We keep thinking it was so bad for us, or South Korea. It was, but one of the reasons that China never invaded during the Vietnam War to help North Vietnam, as their correspondence reveal, is they were still terrified of American artillery and air power as used by Matthew Ridgway. In 100 days, Matthew Ridgway had retaken Seoul and got back over the 38th parallel, and then he did something quite unusual. He stopped. And everybody who had turned on him and said the war was lost, MacArthur's an idiot, said the war's won, you got to go all the way back to China. And he said, not this time. You guys aren't up to it. And that was a very controversial decision, because for the next 2 years it would be sort of trench warfare along the 38th parallel. I say 100 days. What happened? Douglas MacArthur mouthed off one too many times to Harry Truman. He didn't do that with Harry Truman. He sacked him. MacArthur left to Washington in his failed presidential ambitions, and Matthew Ridgway became the theater commander, and there was a new person, General Van Fleet, put in his position. The long and the short of it is, one man within 100 days saved the American military and indeed the geostrategic strategy of the United States. And he was a very, very impressive figure. I will say that as in the case of Belisarius and Themistocles, he was not well liked. He had a propensity of speaking the truth without fear of any consequences, which is lethal in the Washington Pentagon bureaucracy. So where it was very unpopular to integrate the troops, Ridgway insisted upon it. And yet in his retirement, people naturally went to Ridgway and said, well, now we want women in the military. You're the obvious spokesman in his 60s. No, never worked. I'm against it. Dwight Eisenhower went to him in the 50s and said, as President Eisenhower, don't you think we need to get in Vietnam and do what we did in Korea? And he said, what did we do in Korea? We didn't win the war. I saved it, but we didn't win it. No, keep out of Vietnam. JFK, General Ridgway, what you keep out of Vietnam. LBJ didn't listen to him. 1968, Tet Offensive, America's in the same panic it was in 1950. They call Ridgway back in, thinking he's going to say, get out. Basically, his advice is the only thing worse than fighting an ill-thought-out war is losing it if you're a geostrategic power. When Ronald Reagan made a terrible political mistake, a public relations disaster, you remember he agreed to speak at a cemetery in Germany at Bitburg where there were SS soldiers buried, and he needed some cover. Who did he bring out of retirement? 93-year-old Matthew Ridgway, whose basic attitude was, it might have been stupid to go there, but I'm going to see General Steinhoff from the Luftwaffe, shake his hand, and I don't care what people say. We gave him the Medal of Honor, the Medal of Freedom at 95. And this year is the 60th anniversary of Korea, and he was a striking figure. Let me just sum up, and if anybody have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. What did these people have in common? Obviously, they were mavericks. Maybe they're, at best, you could say that they were contrarians, at worst, narcissists, but they had an idea that due to their experience, nobody was more experienced than Belisarius or Themistocles, who had fought at the Battle of Marathon. David Petraeus, whatever you say about his earlier career, was very well connected, but nobody understood counterinsurgency strategy and had written about it. He wrote the book on it, literally, than David Petraeus. They were more experienced, and they were more schooled in what was wrong with the ongoing war than anybody, and they felt that the reason that they had not reached a position of responsibility and power may have been for reasons other than their own. In other words, because I'm not running isn't my fault. General Pétain was a savior general in some sense after Verdun. Same idea. So they had a sense that while everybody is panicking, everybody is usually wrong. What most people do is usually wrong. And from the shadows, they were sizing things up and waiting their moment. They didn't really care whether people liked them or not, and they were not liked. One of the things that reminds me is this Greek idea of the tragic hero. Remember, the tragic hero was somebody who can do something that we can't. And he can do something that we can't to such a degree that he makes us uneasy, whether he's Achilles or Ajax, when he's in our midst. This is the whole essence of the great genre of the Western. If you think of High Noon and Marshal Will Kane, remember that movie? Nobody's going to stop these three people. Will Kane will do it, and as soon as he does, he throws his badge and says, I don't want any part of this bunch, the town of Hadleyville. If you think of Shane, Shane comes out of nowhere and saves everybody, but there's certain elements within Shane that make people uneasy, and it's better that he rides off. Same thing with Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. Any John Ford movie, The Searchers, Ethan Edwards, John Wayne, they're very dangerous people, and we need them in extremists, but we do not want them around us when we don't need them. And that they all shared that. And by that, I would say that they all ended up badly. This is kind of ironic and perhaps controversial, but Themistocles, 25 years after the Battle of Salamis, committed suicide, most likely, and he did it in Persia in service to a Persian king. All of his ideas at Salamis had borne fruition. They defeated Persia. The idea of a modern Athenian navy was his legacy. The social, political, economic vision of having an Athenian Aegean-wide empire was his, and he didn't get credit for it. He created the powerful Athenian democracy in the sense of elevating the poor people. Plato said he wished we had lost the Battle of Salamis, Plato said, rather than to empower the poor the way Themistocles did. And yet he didn't get credit for it. He was exiled, and he ended up killing himself, no doubt, in Persia. Belisarius, have anybody seen that great painting by David Belisarius as the beggar on the streets of Constantinople, blind, impoverished? The man who saved Justinian was put on trial for his life. It is a dangerous thing if you're Justinian, the emperor, and everybody in the empire likes your favorite general more than they do you. Whatever the particular reasons, it would take two evening lectures to explain the Odyssey of Belisarius, but he ended up in his late 50s discredited, recalled, and he came out of retirement one time to save Constantinople when all of its armies were abroad and there was a rapid attack by Huns. And who was there but old Belisarius and 400 knights, and he stopped the attack, and then he was put on trial again. Sherman didn't have a political career. If nominated, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve. He spent most of his time in the 1870s and early 1880s refighting the Civil War. People on his right said that he had been a terrorist, that for some reason the idea that you go through Georgia, say from Atlanta to Savannah, and you only lose 100 of your own soldiers and you only kill 600 of the others makes you a terrorist, while in the Army of the Potomac, 30,000 people who don't own slaves on the South are being killed. And Lee and Grant were not terrorists, but Sherman was, because he attacked the plantations of the very wealthy, the 3% who owned slaves, and he conducted a psychological warfare. But he was not a happy person when he died. Yeah, I think of all American generals, in some ways, he was the most gifted. Ridgway, as I said, at first people recognized that after he saved Korea, he went on to be senior NATO commander, and obviously he should have been chairman of the Joint Chiefs. That was passed over. He got on the wrong side of Dwight Eisenhower. That was a very bad thing to do, because for 20 years there was no more influential military political leader, and Eisenhower let him go from 60 to 62, and then he forcibly retired Ridgway. Eisenhower disliked him so much that if you read Eisenhower's memoir, he actually says this: in March of 1951, General Van Fleet retook Seoul, South Korea, not Matthew Ridgway. General Van Fleet was not even in the theater. He wasn't even in Korea. So much was his dislike of Matthew Ridgway, both because of his advice about Vietnam, but his complete insistence that Eisenhower, as Truman had, was weakening the conventional military, and the future of America was not a nuclear war. And he was not well liked by Omar Bradley, who would praise him when he was popular and pull away from support when he was not. And although he had a long life, it was not a happy one. His first two children ceased speaking to him from his first marriage. His third marriage was alone, happy to Penny. He had an 18-year-old son who was his pride and joy, Matthew Ridgway Jr., and he was killed as a Boy Scout troop leader. He was walking along a railroad, and a slow-moving train happened to come and just nicked a canoe somebody was carrying that hit him in the head. And it was one of the great tragedies of his life. But by the time he died at 97, he was forgotten. But as Colin Powell said, every American soldier owes this man a debt of gratitude. When I finished the book, in conclusion, one of the editors said to me in a comment, "I guess Petraeus nullifies your rule that everybody ends up poorly," because this was in November, right before the election. And I thought, well, yeah, I guess so. David Petraeus is now the head of CIA, and he's, despite all the General Petraeus ads and the demagoguery that was used against him, he ended up as a senior statesman. And then those problems happened where the Paula Broadwell affair, the resignation from the CIA, and now as we speak, all of these things are caught up in the partisan fight over Benghazi and all of these issues, and it won't be resolved. But I wouldn't be surprised if someone as gifted and visionary as David Petraeus will find that the epic moment of his career was the surge somewhere in September of 2008, when for one moment David Petraeus saved the reputation of the American military in Iraq, and probably the reputation of America in the Middle East, as no one else could. And everything else after that, in the case of Themistocles or Belisarius, is likewise downhill. A final comment is, one thing I didn't point, because we have a limited time, is that these were not just savior generals in the sense of how to win the battle or the war at the moment. They were political visionaries. Themistocles didn't want to just win the Battle of Salamis. He wanted to create Athens into a maritime cosmopolitan democracy as part of that. And he did. And Belisarius didn't just want to secure the borders of Byzantium and expand them, but with his fellow Latin-speaking Thracian king, Emperor Justinian, he wanted to recreate the Western Empire. If you ask why somebody from Thrace would get in a ship and go all the way to North Africa and fight the Vandals, the most barbaric and savage of all people, because he really believed. He believed in Rome, and he believed the idea that Rome and the West was better than the alternative. And if we look at Matthew Ridgway, he was a prophet at a time when people said either the United States must demobilize and go back to the isolationism of the 1930s, or it can rest behind a fortress of nuclear weapons. He said, no, we have global responsibilities in the vacuum of the erosion of the British Empire and the rise of Soviet hegemony, and we will have to fight conventional wars. We have to build up our conventional forces, and we have to fight smart. And he created that idea. And General Petraeus, as I said, wrote the book on counterinsurgency. And whatever one argues whether counterinsurgency was the real catalyst for the victory, I don't think anybody would doubt that David Petraeus understood the hearts and minds of people in the Middle East, as he had in the Balkans, and he really has now fashioned a doctrine that when American soldiers hit the ground in an intervention, they're not just going to rush in and kill somebody. They understand the geostrategic and political consequences of being deployed by the United States in areas that are damned if you do and damned if you don't. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you. Yes?
Why did Scipio Africanus not end up here?
Well, I was going to have Scipio Africanus, but two reasons. One, I wanted to have an accessible book of about 120,000 words. The other was that I didn't want to overload antiquity too much, because I had Themistocles and a person from the Roman era, so to speak. But Scipio Africanus in the Second Punic War fought, as you know, in the second half restoration. It's a little hard to know whether he alone established the strategy, but he did. He ended up at Zama winning the war, so he's a likely candidate. But when you select 5 pocket biographies, the first thing that arises as you ponder which 5 is, why not the next 25? Out of 2,500 years of Hernan Cortez, after the Noche Triste, was wiped out, and yet somehow he salvaged the reconquest of the Azteca. It was the Duke of Marlborough. I don't know how he ever did what he did, but there's a lot of people that follow, and the funny thing is they follow the same maverick line, that they're not establishment types, and they don't think in contemporary terms. Any other? Yes?
One of my favorite generals is Patton.
Yes.
And naturally, having seen the movie, I couldn't understand what was his motivation for starting a war with the Russians at the end of World War II.
Yes.
And what did he know to motivate him to
Well, I
want to do
wrote
that?
a long biography of Patton as part of a book called The Soul of Battle about 15 years ago, and that's why he's not in here. But he really did, as I said, after the collapse of the American effort in North Africa with General Freudenthal and the Kaiserine Pass, he restored morale and efficacy to the American forces. He was the architect of the brilliant American performance in Sicily. Had he not slapped 2 soldiers and done some other things in public statements, he would have probably been given command of Italy. Had he been given command of Italy instead of Mark Clark, I don't think that he would have made those mistakes, and we would have been past the Gustav line and all the way up into northern Italy by the end of 1944. That was tragic. He came in late. You know, Armour Bradley, you saw the movie. Carl Malden was not George Patton's friend. Omar Bradley was in some ways a conniver. And so Patton came in late, and yet in just July and August, he went all the way to the Siegfried Line. It was a brilliant performance. We're going to appreciate Patton more and more now because the establishment of Bradley, Eisenhower, Hodges are dead. Their advocates are not as influential. And every biography that comes out now about Patton tunes out the sort of maniacal statements he said and looks exactly what he did. Great historians like Carlo D'Este have really shown that. But your question is, why did he want to fight the Russians, our allies? Well, he got into Czechoslovakia, and he quickly understood that there had been an agreement between Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill that there would be demarcation lines in Germany, and it would be divided. And while they thought, maybe not Churchill, that the Russians were now our allies, Patton, who was a committed anti-communist, knew that these are the people who had killed 20 million of their own in the 30s, and why were you dividing Germany up? Because they would not allow elections to be taking place in Eastern Europe or Eastern Germany, so he didn't trust them. And I think he said something to the effect, did we really fight World War II because a totalitarian had absorbed Eastern Europe, meaning Hitler, only to defeat him and hand it over to another totalitarian? And that was at a time when the status quo in the United States at the end of the Roosevelt and the beginning of the Truman administration had been Russia is a friend. Their sordid past is now behind them. They're going to work with us. We're going to rebuild Europe together. And they're not what we think they are. So Patton was relieved of command and put into a nominal role as an archival general. And then, of course, the mysterious death, I think it was just an accident, but that started a conspiracy theory that he was somehow killed. So anyway, questions? Yes?
What is the increased use of drone warfare likely, how is it likely to affect our willingness to still be able to use conventional warfare or politically want to use conventional warfare?
Well, we have this new strategy. Drones, the technology has evolved so rapidly that we're able now to put the drone in the air from 24 to 48 hours. They have heavier weaponry. They're far more accurate than they were in 2003. And in as much as George Bush probably killed 250 people, maybe 350, we don't know the accurate number. We've killed over 3,500, almost 4,000. We can't figure out the morality of it. For some reason, it's considered amoral to capture somebody and torture 3 confessed terrorists who confessed to a role in 9/11, but then to be judge, jury, and executioner and blow up suspected terrorists. I don't think the American people find that logical, so we're now re-examining drone use, but you can see why it appeals to a society distracted from war when a drone is out of sight, out of mind. You don't see the carnage, you don't see the burned flesh. You don't see the grandson that just happened to walk in the door when the terrorist is killed. The Taliban are very adroit at planning the scene of the attack with, tricycles as if there's people there. And so we're dealing with that in a moral, legal, and political way. And I think the president realizes now that, as a very fierce critic of the Bush-Cheney anti-terrorism protocols, that his preference for drone is not sustainable. And so and I'm not saying it didn't have military efficacy, it surely did, because it told the terrorists, well, you may be able to do something like Tsarnaev did, or Major Hassan, but we can put a Hellfire missile inside your living room at any time we want. So that had some deterrent effect, but I don't think in the American way of war it's a sustainable policy unless it's articulated and explained to the American people, and it has not been. And I think it's going to be either dropped or explained. Yes.
Back in the 90s, I started my PhD program at Santa Barbara.
Yes.
And Dr. Brownlee said if I ever wanted to write, I needed to write like you.
Oh, that can be a curse. Be careful.
And then,
you should read my mail.
and then Dr. Paul Sonino used to say that, in fact, the first readings I had to do was your introduction to the new book on Thucydides.
Yes.
And he said basically, to understand, to read Hanson, you understand history. So I've got a question for you. You call Ridgway a Thucydidean type of general. Why is that?
Oh, I'm sorry?
You call Ridgway
Yes.
a Thucydidean style
Yes, he was
general?
a Thucydidean. What do I mean by a Thucydidean general? What's that sort of, I guess it's a pretentious term, Thucydidean. All it means is that the historian Thucydides had a basic idea that human nature was constant. It was constant. So whether you're shooting a flintlock or an M16, why you're shooting it, the fear you encounter, the strategy, it's going to be the same. And Thucydides actually articulates that. He says, my history will be of some use to people in the future unless the nature of man changes. And what I meant by that was when Ridgway was in Korea and people were saying to him, war has completely changed. There's nuclear weapons now. You don't understand the ideology. It's a force multiplier now of communism. It's like nothing we've ever encountered. You don't understand these new Asian hordes, very kind of racist idea about Asians. And this man said in Thucydidean fashion, human nature hasn't changed. People get cold. People are too far from their supply bases. People react emotionally. If everybody in the United States is abandoning us in Korea, it's because we're not winning. Start winning, and they will be for us again. And that was sort of a reassuring idea, and the way that Petraeus had done that too. I had a grandfather who was a farmer, and I live on a farm today, and some of my relatives are here. And he once said something I never forgot. I would go out and irrigate with him. And he pushed a button. We had the oiler, and the 15 horsepower pump came on, and the water came out about 1,000 gallons a minute. And we were talking about farming. I was about 16, and he said, out in the yard I do this with a hand pump and I get 3 gallons a minute. And he said, you think the water's any different? And what he was trying to tell me is that he may have been using mules or horses, or he might have had hand, but the essence is the same: water, agriculture, the science of growing food, the whole hopes and dreams of farming. It hasn't changed, no matter, it's just more baffling. And so human nature is like water, and technology is like a pump. It baffles us, it confuses us, but we shouldn't confuse pumps with water, or computers with ideas. We can communicate on Twitter much faster. It doesn't mean that we're going to say anything. We still have to be educated. Yes, dear.
How much more intense do you think the terrorist threat is going to become in this country?
How much more intense? Well, in Thucydidean fashion, I'm a little worried about the terrorist threat because, let's be honest, 90% of the recent incidents are people who are what they would call themselves radical Islamicists. And we have used euphemism. Major Hassan was workplace violence. General Casey said that he was worried about the attack, that it threatened the diversity program. Janet Napolitano called terrorism man-caused disasters, overseas contingency operation. Mr. Brennan said that jihad was a holy struggle. We were told, I could go on and on, I don't want to get partisan, but the point is that people in this administration thought the last administration overreacted and unfairly had single out Islamicists. So we were going to use the word Islamist, we were going to use the terror, and then people in the Islamic world would be so relieved that they would say to terrorists, don't do that, don't put a target on their back. And I just haven't seen that happen yet. And I'm worried that the FBI or the CIA had interrogated Major Hassan. They had interrogated Mr. Al-Awlaki. They had interrogated the person who shot the military recruiter, I think it was in Arkansas. They had interrogated the people in Benghazi had been known, and yet for political or ideological reasons we had not rounded them up or beefed up security because we thought that that would be counterproductive. And I understand there's a therapeutic and a tragic view of terrorism, but you have to combine the two. You have to reach out, but then you have to deal severely with the bad guys and make them know that you're unpredictable, a little crazy, and that you're not really worried whether they like you or not. And I'm afraid that we're erring on the therapeutic. Yes, question.
Hi, Dr. Hanson, I was just
Yes.
wondering, we have so many things competing with us in the media, and war is clearly something we need to focus on. How do we compete with something like a Twitter or a Facebook? We're so distracted so easily. How do we focus the people into prioritizing what's right and good?
That's a good question because I think there's something like 200 peace studies programs in the United States, and there's 5 military histories. And peace studies is based on the principle that war can break out by accident, or diplomacy can prevent wars. And military history is based on the idea that wars are caused sometimes for tangible reasons, but to use the Thucydidean word, often over a matter of perceived interest, pride, fear. Like Mr. Borges, the great novelist, said of the Falklands, 2 bald-headed men are fighting over a comb. Or the Chinese and the Japanese are going to kill each other over a piece of rock out in the Sea of Japan. So that's what causes war. We know how they're fought, we know what ends them, we know what leads to peace. And it's a tragic view that you have to deter somebody, and then if you don't deter somebody, like we did on the eve of World War II, they might take a stupid gamble and risk something that they otherwise wouldn't. Then you have to defeat them militarily and humiliate their political system and then rebuild. And we've lost that because people don't know about military history. Yet if you were to walk through Barnes & Noble tonight, the military history war section is much bigger than the peace studies. If you turn on the military history war channel, if you look at the movie or Black Hawk Down, there's those enormous, in the dark hearts of us all, there's an attraction, whether it's good or bad, toward war, because time and character and emotion and reason, they're all compressed during war. So it's going to be with us whether we like it or not. You know, that great Trotskyite idea, or Lenin, whoever, we don't know quite who said it, but if you're not looking for war, war finds you. So you may think that you've evolved to a higher state and we're not Neanderthal anymore, only bad, stupid people fight wars, but if you do that, you're going to get somebody from Fresno killed, it seems to me. Yes, Lou.
If in 2016 the parties are reversed in the White House and in Congress, do you think they would actually ban drones?
If the parties were reversed?
Yeah, in other words, you get a Republican president and a Democratic legislature. Do you think the whole opinion on drone assassinations would completely change?
Well, I'm pretty cynical in my view of partisanship. And as you know, the Republicans are in a terrible dilemma because they supported this protocol. And it was renditions, Guantanamo, wiretaps, intercepts, drones. And Barack Obama's in a terrible dilemma because he came in saying these were shredding the Constitution and we're not, and, you know, knocking the door in the middle of the night, close Guantanamo. And then he more or less embraced or expanded all the protocols he criticized, and the right didn't know what to do because they thought, well, wait a minute. On the one hand, he's so smooth and post-national, everybody likes him. He can kill a lot of the bad guys, and they won't criticize him like they did Bush. And then the other guy said, well, wait a minute. He demagogued the issue and hurt us when he was a sinner. We got to pay him back. And they didn't support what they otherwise would have supported. So it's all of these issues hinge on whether they're successful or not. And if they're successful, and drones, whatever you say, have been successful, so that's why the Republicans, except for people like Rand Paul, haven't objected to them. But I don't think they're sustainable, drones aren't. simply because the United States, if you take the word drone out of the vocabulary and think CIA, assassination, Cold War, it's the same idea. You got a target list. Barack Obama, I think, leaked, somebody in his administration leaked, at least Secretary of Defense Bob Gates said, shut the F up to one of them. He leaked the idea that he was so anguished about drones that he had to read St. Thomas Aquinas before he ordered the next hit. And what he was trying to do, as you can see what he was trying to do, he was trying to tell the American people, I'm not a cold-blooded killer, because the operation is cold-blooded killing. So it's a dilemma for whoever is president. I don't know how, well, one more question. Somebody had, yes.
You've mentioned that several of the generals have had personal failings.
Yes.
Can you comment on the current climate where we seem to want our soldiers and our generals to be great at the military things, but also nice guys and good husbands? And is it possible to be a great general and a nice guy?
I can't answer that because I am completely baffled by this notion that we are risque and Victorian at the same time. In other words, you can see the Kardashians on TV, you can see near pornography, you can see people use the F word, the lyrics, the video games are just absolutely morally and ethically atrocious. And yet we have a national meltdown because David Petraeus, late in life, was attracted to a very attractive, brilliant young woman, and he had an affair, which is regrettable. In olden times, such as World War II, we were a much more traditional society. We would have been appalled by rap, we would have been appalled by the cheap pornography, and yet Dwight Eisenhower, if I could be so bold, was probably, I say probably because we don't know, Kay Summersby wrote a memoir in which he said as much, but he was probably carrying on an affair with his chauffeur while he was the head of SHAEF, directing the entire American war effort. Nobody ever accused David Petraeus of that. George Patton, we know, was carrying on a war with his stepniece, carrying on an affair with his stepniece while he was leading the Third Army. Now, that begs the question. So you go to our risque society, no holds barred, pretty trashy society if you ask me. We go to a guy like George Patton and we say, you know what, we found out that you were sleeping with this young, beautiful woman, so we're going to take Third Army from you. Well, a lot of people are going to get killed if we take Third Army. We did that when he slapped 2 soldiers. We know where that leads. So it's a schizophrenic society. The more in our daily life that we have no ethics or morality or traditional concerns, almost as in the manner of medieval exemption or penance. You know, say you're a moneylender or you're a philanderer and you want to go to heaven, then you give 6 blocks to build the dome at St. Peter. You buy your way into heaven. Well, what we do now is we live pretty trashy lives and then we say, well, I'm not going to buy a block to get into heaven, but I'm going to damn David Petraeus. I'm just shocked that he's doing the same thing that everybody around me. But nobody makes the argument that he was a less effective. You could make that argument, but when General Allen, we really tortured General Allen, by exchanging kind of silly emails that everybody seems to do at one point in their life. And I'm worried about it. It's an excellent question because if you, in conclusion, if you look at the 4 great generals of the last 20 years, I'm not talking about Tommy Franks or George Casey. There were 4 of them. There was General Mattis, who was suddenly, I think, retired a little bit early under pressure from the administration. There was David Petraeus. There was General Allen that I knew at the Naval Academy, and General McChrystal, and each one of them retired early or for some reason other than their military capability, and I think that they had a lot of contributions they would have made. And so we lost those people, and if we're going to lose those people for moral outrage, then we, the people who are outraged, at least have to have some morality, and we don't. Thank you very much. That was sort of the sign, the first inroad that marked the end of Roman civilization. Very tragic to read. And yet, in a matter of 90 days, Belisarius took back North Africa, reclaimed it for Christian, Greek-speaking Byzantium, proclaimed that he had united the West, and didn't stop there. He went to Sicily, did the same thing, and then he went into Italy. And just as Themistocles was sort of a renegade, so was Belisarius. In a nation of Greek speakers, he was a Latin-speaking Thracian, which really did him well in the West where people spoke Latin. He was young, and unlike most Byzantine commanders, he was not corrupt. He had two main tenets, because the Byzantines, as you know, were always outnumbered. They relied on discipline and technology and mercenaries, but he said that he had to be a fish that swam in a local pond. So he enforced strict discipline on soldiers. They did not loot or steal from the Berbers or the Sicilians or the Italians, but in the first sign of counterinsurgency strategy, he incorporated local populations to help him, and he used lightning quick tactics. He avoided pitched battle, and he was able in a period of 25 years to reclaim, at least for 2 generations, Byzantine power in the West. When Belisarius started, the Byzantine Empire was about 40% of the former Roman Empire, and when he finished, it was 80%. And some of you say, well, Justinian died, there was a great plague that wiped out 1 million Byzantines. Belisarius ended up in poverty and blind, and a lot of that land was either lost to the Visigoths, the Lombards, or the rise of Islam. Yes, but what it did, it provided a critical cushion around Byzantium, because lo and behold, where most people thought that the Greek speakers in the West would fall around 600 AD, they lasted 900 more years. Didn't fall to that Black Tuesday, 1453. All because of the efforts of, I think, one man, Belisarius. It was the heyday of Byzantium. This is when the great Hagia Sophia church was built by Justinian, and there was the great blues and greens rivalries in the Hippodrome, and he was a man of his times. The third, I thought, well, was there a modern counterpart? And I didn't want to write about people I had before, but in one case I made exception, and that was William Tecumseh Sherman. The war was not lost. And who came in at the 11th hour, and why, and what can we learn from them? Well, it turned out there's dozens of people, you know. Curtis LeMay took over the B-29 program when they said it wouldn't work, and the rest is history, what he did at Japan. But again, I was looking for generals where there was no hope, and if you took an individual out of the battle equation, it was clear to me they would have lost. And I tried to look at the personal characteristics or the command style or the level of erudition or experience they had. And so I took Themistocles of Athens, and I'll give you a little 5-second summary of each one, and then I'll go back and talk about what the traits were that were common to all of them. And remember, in 480 in September, there was no Athens. It had been burned to the ground by the Persians, been occupied by Xerxes. It was the largest invasion of Europe until D-Day, 250,000 people. They swept from Anatolia all the way down to northern Greece. There was no Greece left. It was just the Peloponnese and about 17 city-states. Athens was the demarcation line. The great city-state of Sparta wanted everybody to retreat across the Isthmus of Corinth and give up. One man said, no, we cannot. In fact, if you leave us by ourselves, we'll sail away. And they had a large fleet of about 200 ships. The Allies together had about 370. And they were outnumbered, depending on whose figures you believe in antiquity, 3 or 7 to 1. And one man decided to make that stand, and he could make that stand because for the last 10 years, while everybody had been advocating that the marathon model of infantry was a way to protect Athens, one man said, no, we've got to invest in ships and sailors, the poor, radical democracy. And he was not just the savior of Athens at Salamis, but the architect of what would become the Athenian Empire. Everything before Themistocles was a defeat, and everything after Themistocles at Plataea the next year was a victory. He single-handedly, by his genius, saved Athens, saved Greece, in some sense saved Western civilization in its embryonic form. He was a maverick, he was part Thracian, he was iconoclastic, he was a contrarian, he was obnoxious, he lied, he was an atypical politician, he demagogued the people, he slandered his enemies, and he was an absolute genius. What was wrong with Persia? What was wrong with Persia? Everybody said you cannot stop in the Civil War. Now, most of you remember Gettysburg and Vicksburg, July 4th, 5th, and 6th of 1863, and we all say, well, that's where Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. Earlier, we had done the Emancipation Proclamation the year before. The Union juggernaut of manpower, technology, greater resources, industrialization had just worn down the South. Bobby Lee was not going to go ever north again. True, but fast forward a year later, and let me name some other titles that might give you a different impression. Cold Harbor, The Wilderness, Petersburg, Spotsylvania. In that horrible summer in Northern Virginia, Ulysses S. Grant destroyed the Army of the Potomac. It was not an army, it was a revolving door where immigrants came in, were enlisted, and were killed or wounded and replaced by others. And Grant had been the hero in March of 1864, given his spectacular victories in the West at Fort Donelson, Fort Henry, Shiloh, and the hero of Vicksburg. Lincoln thought he was going to plow right into Richmond, and as they left in May, he turned over the Army of the West to William Tecumseh Sherman, and they had a very interesting exchange. And if I could summarize both their letters and the impressions of people at the time, Grant was supposed to take Richmond, which was only 70 miles away, and the other great Confederate city was Atlanta, which was over 200 miles. Northern Virginia was settled. The corridor between Washington and Richmond, as you see today, is only about 75 miles. From Tennessee, northern Tennessee to Atlanta was wild. And Sherman had to take an army not just to Atlanta to take that city, but had to navigate through swamps and dirt trails. They both faced an army of about 70,000 men, and they were both brilliantly led by Joe Johnston in the west and Robert E. Lee in the east. So what happened? Well, and then within 90 days, Mary Todd Lincoln said that Ulysses S. Grant was a butcher. Horace Greeley said, the question is not whether a Lincoln shall be elected in the fall. We should not nominate him in June. On his left wing, John C. Fremont said he has abandoned the cause of emancipation. He's not promoting the interests of blacks. He's an ignoramus. And on his right, George McClellan, a Southern Democrat, was saying, and I will have a negotiated peace. We've lost 250, 300,000 King Xerxes in this armada. And he said, wait a minute, it's getting late in the year. It's now September. We're at home. We know the currents of Salamis Bay. They don't. They're 700 miles from their supplies. We're here. They just burned the city that was supposed to house them. By any empirical, logical, but not emotional calculus, they're in trouble. And that seemed absurd. And yet he was able to sway the Spartans and the Corinthians to stay with him. And they went on that day to defeat Salamis, which is probably the greatest or I should say the most lethal sea battle in history. 80,000 Persian sailors probably were killed, much more than Lepanto or Midway or Trafalgar. The second person that I looked at, if you fast forward almost 1,000 years, we don't really know much about him anymore. If I say Belisarius, maybe some of you have read Robert Graves' great novel, Count Belisarius, but otherwise we don't know who he was. He was a very obscure guy. The Byzantine Empire, remember, in the 6th century A.D., we're talking about 525 to about 545, was on the ropes. Rome had for a century lost the West. The Vandals, Visigoths, Ostrogoths had overrun Italy. They had occupied North Africa. They had cut the empire in two. The Greek segment, the Greek-speaking Roman Empire, had collapsed around Constantinople and areas in Anatolia, and they were swarmed on their frontiers mostly by what we would call the Sassanids or the Persians. And this is right before the rise of Islam, and it looked pretty bleak. An iconoclastic king named Justinian, emperor in the Byzantine context, had a wild idea of 100 years after the fall of much of the Western Empire to retake it. And he entrusted this 20-something young man named Belisarius. He sent him east, and he began to win. He defeated the Persians. He went all the way to Iraq. He fortified the border between Byzantium and Persia. He fortified what we call now the Holy Land, the Middle East. And then, most spectacular of all, he sent an armada with only about 18,000 men, about 800 miles all the way to what we would call Tunisia and Libya and parts of Morocco, which had been overrun by Vandals for 100 years. Some of you who are fans of St. Augustine remember him being trapped at Hippio Regius, where the Vandals overran North Africa.
Victor Davis Hanson profiles 5 generals who he argues single-handedly turned around wars that their countries were losing. It's a little over an hour.
Thank you very much for coming out on a weeknight in Fresno in the summer. I know it's been very hot here, and I appreciate it. I'd like to talk just for about 30 minutes on the theme of the book, The Savior Generals, and then I'd like to have questions from you for 15 or 20 minutes, if that's okay. You know, there's a whole genre of generals, leadership, in the terms of what succeeds and what fails. So there was a 19th century genre, the great captains, by a man named Dodge. There was the great battles of the world, and we were supposed to learn that across time and space, Saladin or Hannibal or Wellington and Napoleon had particular characteristics. They were audacious, or they were calm under fire, or they were especially schooled in military history. Some magic ingredient that they shared with like kindred souls across the centuries. And then there was the other genre, anatomy of error, anatomy of folly, all of the losers of history. Mark Clark in Italy, Westmoreland in Vietnam, Marshal Ney at Waterloo. And we were supposed to learn what not to do. And these were not only biographies, but they were also models of leadership. They were very popular in the 19th century. But the more I, over the last 30 years, read these little miniature or pocket biographies, the more that I noticed that in a lot of cases, Napoleon won when he had greater numbers or greater organization, or he was not fighting the entire alliance of Europe. Or in World War II, a great savior general, of course, George Patton, North Africa, who came into command after the Kaiserine passed. But there's no greater fan of George Patton than myself. But had Patton not been in North Africa, we probably would have found somebody like Lucian Truscott or Manton Eddy that could have assumed that role of leadership, because there were other factors, Hitler's stupidity, the genius of George Marshall and Allenbrook on the Allied side, the role of the Russians, that would have made the victory still possible. So I tried to look across history and say, well, what happens when the war was lost? Not only lost tactically, strategic, politically, but the people, whether it was mostly in a consensual society, but sometimes in authoritarian governments, they gave up as well. And then